There is a photograph taken on September 2, 1944, somewhere over the South Pacific, that captures something essential about the man this story is about. A young naval aviator, barely 20 years old, is plunging toward the cold ocean below. His plane is on fire. 2 of his crewmates are already gone. He has done everything right, released his bombs, hit the target, completed the mission, and now the machine that carried him into battle is falling apart around him. He pulls the handle, the canopy blows, and he is suddenly suspended in open air above a vast and indifferent sea, parachuting down toward whatever comes next. That young man would one day command the largest military coalition since the Second World War. He would preside over the peaceful end of the most dangerous ideological conflict in human history. He would make decisions in darkened rooms that shaped the fate of hundreds of millions of people, and he would do it all without flinching, without grandstanding, and very often without credit. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush, and the story of his life is one of the most consequential and most misunderstood stories of the 20th century. Think about what it means to be genuinely great at something and never quite get the recognition for it. Think about winning the Super Bowl and having people remember mostly that you didn't celebrate correctly afterward. Think about spending an entire career in service, real service. The kind that involves actual risk, actual sacrifice, actual loss, and then having a younger, shinier politician sweep in and make you look like yesterday's news. That was George H.W. Bush. He was a man of extraordinary accomplishment who was somehow cursed to be chronically underestimated, underappreciated, and ultimately undone by the very qualities that made him exceptional. But history has a longer memory than the American electorate, and in the decades since he left office, the verdict has shifted dramatically. Scholars who once dismissed him as a one-term placeholder now rank him among the most competent foreign policy presidents in American history. The world he helped shape in those 4 years between 1989 and 1993, the peaceful reunification of Germany, the managed dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the liberation of Kuwait, was a world that could have gone catastrophically wrong in a dozen different ways, and it didn't, in large part because of the man in the Oval Office. So who was George H.W. Bush, really? Not the cartoon figure of the campaign trail, not the gentle grandfather of the late years, not the villain of the liberal critique or the hero of the conservative hagiography, but the actual man, the full human being, with all his contradictions and silences and surprising depths. He was born on June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts, the second of 5 children of Prescott Sheldon Bush and Dorothy Walker Bush. And from the very first breath he drew in that prosperous New England world, the essential tension of his life was already present, the tension between an immense inherited privilege and a genuine, deeply felt hunger to earn something of his own. The Bush family was not simply wealthy in the casual American sense of the word. They were wealthy in the old Eastern establishment sense, the kind of wealth that comes with certain expectations, certain codes of conduct, certain quiet assumptions about the shape a life should take. Prescott Bush, George's father, was a tall, dignified Wall Street banker and investment executive who later became a United States Senator from Connecticut. He was by all accounts a formidable presence, authoritative, principled, demanding, and not particularly warm in the ways that children need warmth. He expected excellence. He communicated that expectation in the restrained, elliptical language of the New England patrician class, which is to say that he rarely said outright, "I'm proud of you," but instead conveyed approval through the absence of criticism, through a nod, through the way he stood a little straighter when his son was in the room. Dorothy Walker Bush, George's mother, was a different kind of force entirely. She was the daughter of George Herbert Walker, the family patriarch whose initials George would carry for his entire life, like a weight and a badge simultaneously, and she brought to motherhood an intensity of expectation that was, if anything, even more demanding than her husband's, though expressed with greater affection. Dorothy believed in hard work, in competition, in winning, and she believed, crucially, that bragging about winning was the worst possible social sin. You performed, you excelled, and then you moved on, without ceremony, to the next thing that needed doing. This was the atmosphere in which George Bush was formed, and it explains almost everything about him that would later confuse and frustrate the American public. The inability to tout his own accomplishments, the discomfort with self-promotion, the almost physical revulsion at what he called the big I am, the habit of centering yourself in your own narrative, of making everything about your personal journey. In a culture that had come to expect its leaders to perform their own greatness, George Bush was constitutionally incapable of that performance. He thought it was vulgar. He had been taught from birth that it was vulgar. And that instinct, that deep-wired aversion to self-congratulation, would cost him enormously in the world of modern democratic politics. But that was all in the future. In the summer of 1924, he was simply an infant in a prosperous household in Milton, and then in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the family moved when George was young. Greenwich was the right kind of address, the kind that opens certain doors and closes others, and the Bush children were raised inside a hermetically comfortable universe of country clubs and tennis courts and sailing lessons and summer houses at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport, Maine. Kennebunkport. That word would become synonymous with George Bush in a way that few other places become synonymous with a person. Walker's Point was the Bush family's summer compound on the rocky Maine coast, a collection of buildings perched on a point of land where the Atlantic came crashing in with a particular intensity, particularly in the autumn storms. The place represented something essential about who George Bush was, not the Washington power broker, not the Oval Office, not the limousines and the motorcades and the ceremonies, but a man in a fishing boat or on a speedboat, moving fast across cold water, deeply and unselfconsciously happy in a way that power never quite made him happy. He attended Greenwich Country Day School and then, following family tradition, went off to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, which people just called Andover, and which was, and remains, one of the most prestigious and demanding secondary schools in the United States. At Andover, George Bush thrived. He was not the brilliant, solitary genius type. He was something more socially complex and, in many ways, more useful. He was the person everyone liked, the person who brought different kinds of people together, the person who performed well under pressure without appearing to try too hard. He played first base on the baseball team and was captain. He edited the school newspaper. He was elected to student government. He was, in the language of that world, a big man on campus, and he wore the role easily, without the self-consciousness that often accompanies obvious social success. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. George Bush was 17 years old, a senior at Andover, when the Japanese attack on the American naval base in Hawaii pulled the United States into the Second World War. And in that moment, something crystallized in him that would define the next several years of his life. He wanted to fight. Not in the abstract, theoretical sense that young men sometimes feel when patriotism runs high. He wanted to actually get into the actual war, as quickly as possible, with the specific goal of being the youngest naval aviator in the United States Navy. His family had other ideas, or at least his father did. Prescott Bush urged his son to go to college first, to let the war progress a little, to not be reckless with his life. George had already been accepted to Yale. The sensible thing, the prudent thing, was to defer. But prudence was not what George Bush felt in that December of his senior year. He graduated from Andover in June of 1942, turned 18 on June 12, and on June 13, the very next day, he enlisted in the United States Navy. He entered Naval Air Station Pre-Flight in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and began the intense, demanding process of becoming a military aviator. This was not a casual undertaking. The washout rates were high, the physical and psychological demands were extreme, and the young men who made it through knew that what awaited them on the other end of their training was real combat, real risk, and the real possibility of death. George Bush made it through. He was commissioned as an ensign, received his naval aviator's wings on June 9, 1943, at the age of 18 years and 11 days, and became at that moment the youngest naval aviator in the United States Navy. He had achieved the specific thing he set out to achieve, in the specific time he had set for himself. He was assigned to fly the Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber that was the standard naval strike aircraft of its era, a three-seat, single-engine machine that carried a crew of pilot, radioman, and gunner, along with a substantial bomb or torpedo load. It was not glamorous, but it was powerful, and it was exactly the kind of aircraft that got you into the thick of actual combat rather than circling at altitude waiting for something to happen. He was posted to Torpedo Squadron 51, based aboard the USS San Jacinto, a light carrier operating in the Pacific. And there, in the vast and brutal oceanic theater of the Pacific War, George Bush began to accumulate the kind of experience that no amount of privilege or breeding or family connection can purchase. The Pacific War was unlike anything that had come before in American military history. The distances were staggering, the logistics were nightmarish, the enemy was skilled and fanatical, and the heat, the humidity, the isolation, and the constant presence of death created a psychological environment that either broke men or tempered them into something much harder than they had been before. George Bush flew 58 combat missions in the Pacific. 58. That is not a man who was hiding behind his family connections or his patrician background. That is a man who was doing his job, repeatedly, under conditions of genuine mortal danger, and doing it well enough to accumulate a Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Air Medals, and the Presidential Unit Citation. But it was the 58th mission, or rather, the one that nearly wasn't, that history has recorded most carefully. On September 2, 1944, Bush was flying a mission against a Japanese radio installation on Chichijima, a small island in the Bonin Islands chain. His Avenger, which his crew had christened Barbara after a young woman named Barbara Pierce whom he had met at a Christmas dance in Greenwich 3 years earlier, was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire as he was beginning his attack run. The engine was struck. Fire began to spread through the forward part of the aircraft. The correct decision, the one that every instinct for self-preservation would have screamed, was to abort the mission, to turn away from the target, to try to get the aircraft far enough from the island to ditch safely in the ocean. George Bush did not do that. He completed his attack run first. With his plane on fire, with smoke pouring into the cockpit, with the controls growing sluggish as the hydraulics were damaged, he held his course, released his bombs on the target, and only then turned the burning aircraft out over the water and gave the order to bail out. He pulled the canopy handle and was flung out into the open air. In the confusion of the ejection, his head struck the tail of the aircraft, and as he fell, tumbling, he realized his parachute had partially deployed but was caught, streaming above him, tangled. He managed to free it. He hit the water hard, and when he came up, gasping, treading water in the warm Pacific, he found himself alone. His two crewmates, radioman second class John Delaney and airman second class William White, were gone. The plane was gone. Chichijima was visible in the distance. He was a 19-year-old man, injured, alone in the Pacific Ocean, with a Japanese-held island a few miles away and no guarantee that anyone had seen him go down. He inflated his life raft and climbed in, and then he waited. And the waiting must have been the worst part, not the mission itself, not the fire, not the ejection, but the floating there afterward with nothing to do but think about what had happened, about where Delaney and White were, about whether anyone was coming. They were coming. The USS Finback, an American submarine, had received the distress signal and was moving toward his position, surfacing to rescue him. It took 4 agonizing hours, during which Japanese boats from Chichijima were also moving in his direction. The Finback got there first. George Bush was pulled aboard, exhausted, bruised, emotionally shattered by the loss of his crewmates, but alive. He spent the next month aboard the submarine as it completed its patrol, and he had time during those weeks to process what had happened, to think about why he had survived when Delaney and White had not, to sit with the particular kind of survivor's guilt that attaches itself to those who come back when others don't. He would carry that guilt quietly for the rest of his life. It would shape his sense of obligation, his insistence on personal duty, his almost compulsive commitment to serving in ways that involved real risk and real sacrifice. It also deepened his faith. George Bush was not a demonstrative Christian in the American evangelical tradition, but he was a genuinely religious man. And the experience of the Pacific, the missions, the fire, the water, the rescue, the lost crewmates reinforced a sense that his survival was not accidental, that it came with responsibilities he was obligated to fulfill. The war ended in August 1945. George Bush had planned to return to the Pacific after his rescue, to continue flying, but after 2 years of combat service and 58 missions, he was discharged when the war concluded. He was 21 years old, he had a Distinguished Flying Cross, and he had a burning desire to do 2 things immediately: marry Barbara Pierce and attend Yale University. Barbara Pierce was the daughter of Marvin Pierce, the publisher of McCall's magazine, and she was, by every account, exactly the right person for George Bush at exactly the right time. They had first met at that Christmas dance in 1941. She was 16, he was 17, and he later said he had fallen for her almost immediately, which, given the events of the next few years, appears to have been the literal truth. He had written to her from the Pacific. She had waited. They were married on January 6, 1945, when he was home on leave at the First Presbyterian Church in Rye, New York, and from that day forward, Barbara was the center of his private universe in a way that nothing else ever quite was. She was formidable, Barbara Bush. Funny, blunt, sharp, deeply opinionated, possessed of a social intelligence that complemented her husband's perfectly. Where George could sometimes be indirect, Barbara was direct. Where George shied away from personal conflict, Barbara embraced it with an almost cheerful energy. She was his emotional anchor, his most trusted advisor, and in many ways the person who kept the whole family enterprise moving forward across 53 years of marriage. People who knew them well said that Barbara always knew exactly what George was thinking, sometimes before he did, and that he trusted her judgment on people and situations with a completeness that bordered on the absolute. Yale was a revelation. He entered in the fall of 1945 under an accelerated program that allowed veterans to complete their degrees in 2.5 years, and he threw himself into it with the same focused energy he had brought to everything else. He majored in economics, joined the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, captained the baseball team, was elected to Skull and Bones, the secret society that has produced a disproportionate share of American public figures, and graduated in June of 1948 with a Phi Beta Kappa key and a degree that represented, at least nominally, the end of his Eastern establishment formation. But George Bush had already decided that the Eastern establishment was not where he wanted to live out his adult life. His father was a senator, his family was embedded in the New York banking world, the comfortable paths were all mapped out in waiting. He had watched enough of that world to know that it would swallow him whole if he let it, that he would become another prosperous Wall Street presence rather than his own man. He wanted something harder, something more genuinely his own. He wanted oil. The decision to move to Texas, specifically to Odessa, Texas, in the Permian Basin, the flat, scorched, relentlessly unromantic landscape of West Texas, was perhaps the most consequential single choice of his life after the decision to enlist. Not because the oil business made him rich, though it eventually did, but because Texas made him who he was. It remade him, socially and politically and temperamentally, in ways that the patrician New England of his childhood never could have. He arrived in Odessa in 1948 with Barbara and their infant son George, who had been born in July 1946 and who would grow up to be the 43rd President of the United States, though nobody was thinking about that in 1948. He arrived with a car, a few $100s, and a connection to Dresser Industries, a manufacturing company where he started at the bottom, literally sweeping equipment, assembling and selling drilling tools to the oil companies operating in the basin. He was good at it. Not because he had any inherited knowledge of the oil business, he didn't, but because he was good with people. Good at understanding what they needed, good at building the webs of relationship and trust that any sales-based business depends on. He learned the technical side quickly, because he was intelligent and he worked obsessively, often putting in 7 days a week. He and Barbara lived in a succession of increasingly modest accommodations, at one point sharing a shotgun house with a mother and daughter who also happened to be running a small side business as prostitutes, which Barbara recorded in her memoirs with a combination of bemusement and characteristic forthrightness. These years in West Texas were forming George Bush in ways that he couldn't fully articulate but that he felt profoundly. He was becoming something other than what his background had made him. He was becoming a Texan, or at least his version of a Texan, which still had traces of the Greenwich accent and the Andover manners but was overlaid with something rougher and more genuine. He was learning what it meant to compete without a safety net, to build something with his own hands and his own relationships, to fail and try again and not be cushioned by the family name when things went wrong. Things did go wrong. There was a daughter, Robin, born in December 1949, who was diagnosed with leukemia in February 1953 and died in October of that year. She was 3 years old. George and Barbara Bush were 29 and 28 respectively when they lost their daughter. And the experience of watching Robin's illness progress and ultimately win, watching a small, bright, uncomplaining child be taken away from them by a disease that medicine was not yet equipped to stop, was a wound that never entirely closed. George Bush rarely spoke publicly about Robin. The grief was too close, too private, too real for the kind of public processing that the modern age demands. But those who knew him well said he thought about her constantly, that she was always present to him in some interior space that public life never quite reached. Professionally, he was ascending. In 1951, he and a friend named John Overby formed a small oil development company. In 1953, they merged with two brothers named Hugh and Bill Letka to form Zapata Petroleum Corporation. The name came from the Marlon Brando film Viva Zapata, which had recently been released, and which seemed appropriately adventurous for the risky business they were undertaking. Zapata did well, extremely well in fact, discovering oil in the Permian Basin and growing rapidly. By the late 1950s, Bush had split off from the Letkas to form his own company, Zapata Offshore, which specialized in the new and technically demanding business of offshore oil drilling, operating drilling rigs in the open ocean rather than on land. It was a field that required significant capital investment and significant nerve, and Bush had both. He moved the company to Houston in 1958, which meant leaving the West Texas world he had come to love and entering the larger, more complex social universe of a major American city. Houston in the late 1950s was a boomtown, a place of spectacular growth and ambition, a city that was reinventing itself faster than it could be described. It was also, increasingly, a place where the political landscape was being reshaped by the kind of conservative energy that would eventually reshape the entire American South. George Bush had been thinking about politics for years. It was the family business. In a sense, his father had been a senator, and the Bush family had deep connections to the Republican Party establishment. But in Texas in the early 1960s, the Republican Party was still very much a minority enterprise. The South was overwhelmingly Democratic, the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction still visible in every courthouse and statehouse in the region. Running as a Republican in Texas in 1962 required either considerable courage or considerable naivety, and probably some of both. Bush ran for the Senate seat being vacated by Democrat Price Daniel in 1964. He lost to Democrat Ralph Yarborough in what was, by any measure, an extremely difficult year to be running as a Republican in Texas. Lyndon Johnson, a Texan himself, won a landslide presidential victory at the top of the ticket, and the coattails were substantial. But Bush had run a creditable race, had introduced himself to the Texas electorate, and had demonstrated that he was a serious political presence rather than a dilettante from the oil patch playing at politics. He ran for Congress in 1966, this time for the 7th Congressional District in Houston, a more Republican-friendly district than the statewide Senate race had been. He won, defeating Democrat Frank Briscoe by a comfortable margin. He was 42 years old, and he was finally in Washington. Congress suited him. He was assigned to the Ways and Means Committee, an unusual assignment for a freshman congressman, reflecting both the power of his family connections and the genuine respect he had already generated among his colleagues. He was hardworking, collegial, willing to do the unglamorous committee work that is the actual substance of legislative life rather than just the public grandstanding that gets television coverage. He was considered a moderate Republican, which in the 1960s meant someone who supported civil rights legislation. He voted for the Fair Housing Act of 1968, a genuinely difficult vote in his largely conservative Texas district, while maintaining fiscally conservative positions on economic questions. Yale was a revelation. He entered in the fall of 1945 under an accelerated program that allowed veterans to complete their degrees in 2.5 years, and he threw himself into it with the same focused energy he had brought to everything else. He majored in economics, joined the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, captained the baseball team, was elected to Skull and Bones, the secret society that has produced a disproportionate share of American public figures, and graduated in June of 1948 with a Phi Beta Kappa key and a degree that represented, at least nominally, the end of his Eastern establishment formation. But George Bush had already decided that the Eastern establishment was not where he wanted to live out his adult life. His father was a senator, his family was embedded in the New York banking world, the comfortable paths were all mapped out and waiting. He had watched enough of that world to know that it would swallow him whole if he let it, that he would become another prosperous Wall Street presence rather than his own man. He wanted something harder, something more genuinely his own. He wanted oil. The decision to move to Texas, specifically to Odessa, Texas, in the Permian Basin, the flat, scorched, relentlessly unromantic landscape of West Texas, was perhaps the most consequential single choice of his life after the decision to enlist. Not because the oil business made him rich, though it eventually did, but because Texas made him who he was. It remade him, socially and politically and temperamentally, in ways that the patrician New England of his childhood never could have. He arrived in Odessa in 1948 with Barbara and their infant son George, who had been born in July 1946 and who would grow up to be the 43rd President of the United States, though nobody was thinking about that in 1948. He arrived with a car, a few $100s, and a connection to Dresser Industries, a manufacturing company where he started at the bottom, literally sweeping equipment, assembling and selling drilling tools to the oil companies operating in the basin. He was good at it. Not because he had any inherited knowledge of the oil business, he didn't, but because he was good with people. Good at understanding what they needed, good at building the webs of relationship and trust that any sales-based business depends on. He learned the technical side quickly, because he was intelligent and he worked obsessively, often putting in 7 days a week. He and Barbara lived in a succession of increasingly modest accommodations, at one point sharing a shotgun house with a mother and daughter who also happened to be running a small side business as prostitutes, which Barbara recorded in her memoirs with a combination of bemusement and characteristic forthrightness. These years in West Texas were forming George Bush in ways that he couldn't fully articulate but that he felt profoundly. He was becoming something other than what his background had made him. He was becoming a Texan, or at least his version of a Texan, which still had traces of the Greenwich accent and the Andover manners but was overlaid with something rougher and more genuine. He was learning what it meant to compete without a safety net, to build something with his own hands and his own relationships, to fail and try again and not be cushioned by the family name when things went wrong. Things did go wrong. There was a daughter, Robin, born in December 1949, who was diagnosed with leukemia in February 1953 and died in October of that year. She was 3 years old. George and Barbara Bush were 29 and 28 respectively when they lost their daughter. And the experience of watching Robin's illness progress and ultimately win, watching a small, bright, uncomplaining child be taken away from them by a disease that medicine was not yet equipped to stop, was a wound that never entirely closed. George Bush rarely spoke publicly about Robin. The grief was too close, too private, too real for the kind of public processing that the modern age demands. But those who knew him well said he thought about her constantly, that she was always present to him in some interior space that public life never quite reached. Professionally, he was ascending. In 1951, he and a friend named John Overby formed a small oil development company. In 1953, they merged with two brothers named Hugh and Bill Liedtke to form Zapata Petroleum Corporation. The name came from the Marlon Brando film Viva Zapata, which had recently been released, and which seemed appropriately adventurous for the risky business they were undertaking. Zapata did well, extremely well in fact, discovering oil in the Permian Basin and growing rapidly. By the late 1950s, Bush had split off from the Liedtkes to form his own company, Zapata Offshore, which specialized in the new and technically demanding business of offshore oil drilling, operating drilling rigs in the open ocean rather than on land. It was a field that required significant capital investment and significant nerve. And Bush had both. He moved the company to Houston in 1958, which meant leaving the West Texas world he had come to love and entering the larger, more complex social universe of a major American city. Houston in the late 1950s was a boomtown, a place of spectacular growth and ambition, a city that was reinventing itself faster than it could be described. It was also, increasingly, a place where the political landscape was being reshaped by the kind of conservative energy that would eventually reshape the entire American South. George Bush had been thinking about politics for years. It was the family business. In a sense, his father had been a senator, and the Bush family had deep connections to the Republican Party establishment. But in Texas in the early 1960s, the Republican Party was still very much a minority enterprise. The South was overwhelmingly Democratic, the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction still visible in every courthouse and statehouse in the region. Running as a Republican in Texas in 1962 required either considerable courage or considerable naivety, and probably some of both. Bush ran for the Senate seat being vacated by Democrat Price Daniel in 1964. He lost to Democrat Ralph Yarborough in what was, by any measure, an extremely difficult year to be running as a Republican in Texas. Lyndon Johnson, a Texan himself, won a landslide presidential victory at the top of the ticket, and the coattails were substantial. But Bush had run a creditable race, had introduced himself to the Texas electorate, and had demonstrated that he was a serious political presence rather than a dilettante from the oil patch playing at politics. He ran for Congress in 1966, this time for the 7th Congressional District in Houston, a more Republican-friendly district than the statewide Senate race had been. He won, defeating Democrat Frank Briscoe by a comfortable margin. He was 42 years old, and he was finally in Washington. Congress suited him. He was assigned to the Ways and Means Committee, an unusual assignment for a freshman congressman, reflecting both the power of his family connections and the genuine respect he had already generated among his colleagues. He was hardworking, collegial, willing to do the unglamorous committee work that is the actual substance of legislative life rather than just the public grandstanding that gets television coverage. He was considered a moderate Republican, which in the 1960s meant someone who supported civil rights legislation. He voted for the Fair Housing Act of 1968, a genuinely difficult vote in his largely conservative Texas district, while maintaining fiscally conservative positions on economic questions. There is a version of this story in which Bush's acceptance of the vice presidential nomination was a graceful concession to political reality, and that version has merit. But there is also a version in which it required Bush to swallow a significant amount of pride. During the primary campaign, he had attacked Reagan's economic program, which he memorably called voodoo economics, a label that stuck and that Reagan supporters never entirely forgave. He had positioned himself as the responsible moderate against Reagan's ideological enthusiasm. Now he was being asked to become Reagan's number two, to subordinate his own views on a wide range of questions, to campaign on behalf of a program he had publicly criticized. He accepted. And having accepted, he was completely and utterly loyal. This is the thing that Bush's critics on the left and his critics on the right both consistently failed to understand about him. His loyalty, once given, was genuine and total. He did not serve as Reagan's vice president while quietly undermining him or signaling to the establishment that he, Bush, was the real grown-up in the room. He was a loyal subordinate, which is both a more admirable and a more difficult thing than it sounds. The Reagan-Bush ticket won a landslide in November 1980, carrying 44 states and sweeping the Electoral College 489 to 49. George Bush became the 43rd Vice President of the United States, and began 8 years of service in a role that was, by design and tradition, almost entirely ceremonial, advisory, and supportive, but almost entirely is doing significant work in that sentence. In fact, the Reagan vice presidency gave Bush something enormously valuable: direct observation of the processes of executive power at the highest level. He attended every significant meeting. He received the same intelligence briefings as the president. He traveled constantly, visiting foreign leaders, attending state funerals, at which vice presidents inevitably appear, since presidents are too important to attend funerals, building the web of personal relationships with heads of state and foreign ministers that would prove invaluable when he himself became president. He was learning, even when it appeared he was merely attending. There was one moment in the Reagan years that tested Bush's character in a way that almost nothing else did: the Iran-Contra affair. The revelation, in late 1986, that members of the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, which was under an arms embargo and which had been holding American hostages, and then used the profits to illegally fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, was one of the most serious political scandals of the era. People went to prison. The administration's credibility was severely damaged. And George Bush was right there, in the middle of it, in the sense that he had attended the meetings, had been briefed on the outlines of the operation, and had been present in the room when many of the relevant decisions were being made. The question of what Bush actually knew and when he knew it became a central issue of his 1988 presidential campaign. He maintained consistently that he had been out of the loop on the most problematic elements of the scheme, that he had known about the arms sales but not about the diversion of funds to the Contras, and that he had expressed reservations about the wisdom of the arms sales at the time. His critics didn't believe him, or at least they didn't find the distinction he was drawing particularly persuasive. The phrase "out of the loop" became one of the signature political phrases of his career, deployed by critics as shorthand for his alleged passivity, but 1988 was still 2 years away. First there was the election to win, and winning it required something that Bush found genuinely difficult: destroying the competition. He secured the Republican nomination relatively easily. His main rival, Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, gave him a serious early fight but could not sustain the challenge and arrived at the general election facing Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. Dukakis was a technocratic moderate Democrat who had come to the convention with a 17-point lead in the polls and who, over the course of the summer, watched that lead evaporate in the face of one of the most effective and brutal campaign operations in American political history. The 1988 Bush campaign, run by Lee Atwater, was a masterwork of aggressive negative politics. The Willie Horton ad, which told the story of a convicted murderer who had committed a rape and assault while on a furlough program that Dukakis had supported as governor, was devastating. The image of Dukakis in a tank, wearing an oversized helmet and grinning what was immediately and permanently labeled a goofy grin, became an icon of political self-destruction. And through it all, Bush performed one of the finest set-piece political speeches of his career at the Republican convention, delivering the phrase "read my lips, no new taxes" with a force and certainty that brought the crowd to its feet. He won on November 8, 1988, with 426 electoral votes to Dukakis's 111, and 53.4% of the popular vote to Dukakis's 45.6%. He was, at 64, the 41st President of the United States. The transition between the Reagan and Bush administrations was notable for what didn't happen as much as for what did. Reagan and Bush were not personally close. There was a coolness there, a distance, that reflected the complicated dynamic of their 8-year partnership, the deference that Bush had shown, the way he had consciously kept himself in the background, the unspoken tension between a former rival who had become a loyal subordinate. Reagan left the White House without, by many accounts, any great warmth toward his successor. Bush, with characteristic discretion, never said much publicly about this, but people who were close to him understood that he felt the chill. What mattered, on January 20, 1989, was the office itself. George Herbert Walker Bush stood on the steps of the Capitol and took the oath of office, and in that moment all the accumulated experience of his career, the Navy, Yale, the oil fields, Congress, the UN, the CIA, the 8 years of watching and learning, was suddenly present tense rather than past. He was the one making the decisions now. He brought to the presidency a team that reflected his core values and his core method of operating. James Baker, his closest friend from Texas, became Secretary of State. Brent Scowcroft, a former Air Force general and brilliant strategic thinker who had served under Ford as National Security Advisor, returned to that role under Bush. Dick Cheney became Secretary of Defense. Colin Powell, who had served as National Security Advisor in the final Reagan years, became Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary collection of national security talent, and Bush deployed it in a particular way that told you everything about how he understood leadership. He listened. He genuinely listened. He asked questions. He solicited dissenting views. He was not the smartest person in the room. He was usually surrounded by people who were smarter than him in specific technical domains, but he had a quality that is rarer than raw intelligence and in some ways more valuable. He knew what he didn't know, and he was not too proud to say so. The world that Bush inherited in January 1989 was one that appeared stable but was in fact on the verge of the most dramatic transformation since the end of the Second World War. The Soviet Empire was cracking. Mikhail Gorbachev had been General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union since 1985, and his programs of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, had opened fissures in a system that had seemed monolithic for decades. Eastern Europe was stirring. Poland had already held partially free elections. Hungary was dismantling its border fence with Austria. He brought to the presidency a team that reflected his core values and his core method of operating. James Baker, his closest friend from Texas, became Secretary of State. Brent Scowcroft, a former Air Force general and brilliant strategic thinker who had served under Ford as National Security Advisor, returned to that role under Bush. Dick Cheney became Secretary of Defense. Colin Powell, who had served as National Security Advisor in the final Reagan years, became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary collection of national security talent, and Bush deployed it in a particular way that told you everything about how he understood leadership. He listened. He genuinely listened. He asked questions. He solicited dissenting views. He was not the smartest person in the room. He was usually surrounded by people who were smarter than him in specific technical domains, but he had a quality that is rarer than raw intelligence and in some ways more valuable. He knew what he didn't know, and he was not too proud to say so. The world that Bush inherited in January 1989 was one that appeared stable but was in fact on the verge of the most dramatic transformation since the end of the Second World War. The Soviet Empire was cracking. Mikhail Gorbachev had been General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union since 1985, and his programs of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, had opened fissures in a system that had seemed monolithic for decades. Eastern Europe was stirring. Poland had already held partially free elections. Hungary was dismantling its border fence with Austria. Something enormous was happening, and the question for the new American president was how to respond, how to encourage the changes without accelerating them so rapidly that they became unmanageable and provoked a violent crackdown. Bush's instinct was cautious. Not because he lacked the courage to act, that instinct had been established definitively in the Pacific, but because he understood, better than almost anyone else in Washington, how fragile the situation was. A careless word, a triumphalist gesture, a speech that crowed about American victory at the wrong moment could give Soviet hardliners exactly the pretext they needed to roll back Gorbachev's reforms, to crack down, to restore order through force. Bush had seen enough of the world, had talked to enough world leaders in enough private settings, to know that the difference between a peaceful transition and a catastrophic one was often a matter of tone, of timing, of the ability to resist the temptation to take a bow. His critics in Washington, particularly the more aggressive voices on the right, were frustrated by what they saw as excessive caution. Where was the bold American leadership? Where was the declaration that the Cold War was over and America had won? But Bush ignored them, or rather, he registered their views and then proceeded to do what he thought was right. This was a pattern that would recur throughout his presidency. He consulted widely. He listened carefully, and then he made his own judgment, and he was not particularly interested in being pressured to change it. The summer and fall of 1989 were the most extraordinary months in post-war European history. In June, Polish voters delivered a massive repudiation of the communist government in the first genuinely free elections held in a Warsaw Pact country since the end of the Second World War. In August, Hungary opened its border with Austria and tens of thousands of East Germans began streaming west through Hungary and into the West. In October, mass protests in East Germany, the most loyal and repressive of the Soviet satellite states, began to shake the government of Erich Honecker. Honecker fell. His successor, Egon Krenz, tried to manage the pressure by announcing changes, including changes to the travel regulations that prevented East Germans from crossing to the West, and then, on November 9, 1989, one of the great miscommunications of political history led to one of the most transcendent moments of the 20th century. A Communist Party spokesman named Gunter Schabowski, imperfectly briefed about the specifics of the new regulations, announced at a press conference that East Germans could travel to the West immediately, without delay. He meant that the new regulations would take effect after an administrative processing period. What happened was something else entirely. Within hours, crowds had gathered at the checkpoints in the Berlin Wall. The guards, who had received no orders, faced an impossible choice: open the gates or fire on their own citizens. They opened the gates. East and West Berliners, separated for 28 years by concrete and wire and the constant threat of death, poured through the openings and embraced each other on the other side. People climbed on top of the wall. People took hammers and picks to it. People danced on the thing that had symbolized the division of Europe and the inhumanity of the system that had built it. The Berlin Wall was falling, and with it, in a very real sense, the Cold War itself. Bush was at his desk in the Oval Office when the news came. He watched the scenes on television, the crowds, the embraces, the wall being physically dismantled piece by piece, and his response was, by the standards of the moment, remarkably subdued. He did not pump his fist. He did not declare victory. He did not get on a plane to Berlin to stand before the crowds and make a speech about freedom triumphant. He sat at his desk, looking almost sober, and when reporters gathered and pressed him about his reaction, he acknowledged that it was a very positive development and that he was pleased. He was, a reporter said, not showing the emotion I would have expected, and Bush replied that he was not an emotional kind of guy. The world largely misread this moment. It seemed like passivity, like missing the significance of what was happening, like an oddly muted response to a historical earthquake. Bush cut through all of this. He decided early that German reunification was right, both morally. German self-determination was a principle the United States had championed for decades, and strategically, a reunified Germany inside NATO was far more stable than any alternative arrangement. He threw American support behind Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor who was the other essential driver of reunification, and he worked the diplomatic back channels with a skill that was invisible to the public and essential to the outcome. The 2+4 agreement, signed in September 1990, formalized the reunification of Germany and its continuing membership in NATO. It was a remarkable achievement, accomplished against significant resistance from multiple quarters, and Bush's personal relationship diplomacy was central to making it happen. All of this was prologue. The defining crisis of his presidency, the one that tested everything he had built and everything he was, began on August 2, 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was not entirely a surprise. Intelligence agencies had been tracking the buildup of Iraqi forces on the Kuwaiti border for weeks, and there had been diplomatic signals that something might be coming. But the speed and decisiveness of the invasion, a massive armored thrust that overran Kuwaiti defenses in a matter of hours and had Baghdad's forces in control of the entire country by nightfall, was still shocking. Iraq now controlled approximately 20% of the world's known oil reserves and was positioned to threaten Saudi Arabia, which held another 25%. A single hostile power controlling nearly half of the world's petroleum supply would represent a fundamental shift in the global balance of power and a catastrophic threat to the world economy. Bush's response was immediate and, in retrospect, remarkable for its speed and clarity. Within hours of the invasion, he had spoken with Thatcher, who famously told him, "This is no time to go wobbly, George," with other allied leaders, with his national security team. Within days, he had obtained a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning the invasion and demanding Iraqi withdrawal. Within weeks, he had assembled the framework of what would become one of the largest military coalitions in history, 35 nations, contributing forces ranging from the massive American presence to significant British, French, Arab, and other contingents. The coalition was itself an achievement of extraordinary diplomatic sophistication, getting Arab nations to join a military effort against another Arab nation, in a conflict that was playing out against the backdrop of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and decades of resentment about Western involvement in the Middle East, required exactly the kind of patient, personal, relationship-based diplomacy that Bush had been practicing for decades. He made phone call after phone call, there were hundreds of them, logged in the White House switchboard records, calls to leaders all over the world at all hours of the day and night. He deployed Baker to do the diplomatic heavy lifting on the ground. He worked Gorbachev to ensure that the Soviet Union would not exercise its Security Council veto to protect its old Iraqi client. The military buildup in Saudi Arabia, Operation Desert Shield, was itself a logistical tour de force, moving 500,000 American troops and their equipment to the Arabian Peninsula, setting up the supply lines and bases and command structures necessary to sustain a major military campaign in the desert, while simultaneously maintaining a credible diplomatic track that gave Saddam Hussein the opportunity to withdraw peacefully. All of this required a level of organizational and political coordination that would have tested any administration. Bush's team handled it with impressive competence. Throughout the fall of 1990, Bush was also managing an intense internal debate about the right strategy. The question was not whether Saddam needed to be removed from Kuwait, on that there was broad consensus. The question was how. The administration's military commanders, led by General Norman Schwarzkopf, were requesting significant additional forces beyond the initial deployment, arguing that a robust offensive capability was necessary to ensure a rapid and decisive victory. Some in Washington argued for a purely economic approach, tighten the sanctions, wait Saddam out, avoid the risk of a ground war. Others argued that the military option was the right one but needed to be used immediately. Before the coalition frayed, Bush listened to all of this. He listened to Schwarzkopf, who needed more forces. He listened to Powell, who had deep reservations about military action and who laid out the risks with characteristic thoroughness. He listened to Baker, who argued for one more diplomatic push before committing to force. He listened to Cheney, who was more hawkish, and then he made his decision. They would use force if Saddam did not withdraw, and they would use it with overwhelming power, in the shortest possible time, to minimize casualties and maximize decisiveness. Congress was another challenge entirely. The administration needed congressional authorization, politically and arguably legally, though the precise boundaries of presidential war powers were, as always, contested. Bush worked the Hill, meeting with congressional leaders, listening to concerns, making arguments. The debate was intense and, in places, genuinely moving. Senators who had served in Vietnam spoke of the costs of wars that are entered without full national commitment, of the importance of this moment, of the weight of the decision they were being asked to make. On January 12, 1991, Congress authorized the use of force by votes of 52 to 47 in the Senate and 250 to 183 in the House. On January 17, 1991, at 2:38 in the morning local time, the first coalition airstrikes hit Baghdad. Operation Desert Storm had begun. The air campaign lasted 38 days. It was unlike anything that had been seen in modern warfare. Precision-guided munitions striking specific buildings while leaving adjacent structures intact, aircraft flying thousands of sorties with almost unbelievable effectiveness, Patriot missile batteries attempting to intercept Scud missiles aimed at Israel and Saudi Arabia. The world watched, transfixed, as CNN broadcast live images from Baghdad, the tracers arcing across the night sky, the thunder of explosions, the bizarre surrealism of watching a city being bombed in real time from a hotel room a few miles away. Saddam attempted to draw Israel into the conflict, firing Scud missiles at Israeli cities in the hope that Israel would retaliate and thereby fracture the Arab components of the coalition. Bush exerted enormous pressure on the Israelis to hold back, to absorb the attacks and trust the coalition to handle Saddam. It was an extraordinary request asking a sovereign nation to allow its civilians to be attacked without responding, and the fact that Israel complied was a measure of the trust that had been built through patient diplomacy. The Patriot batteries weren't perfectly effective, as later analysis would show, but they provided enough psychological cover for the Israelis to justify restraint. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. It lasted exactly 100 hours. The ground assault, which Schwarzkopf had designed around a massive flanking movement that swept through the desert west of Kuwait and came in from the north and west, the famous Hail Mary play, was devastating in its speed and effectiveness. Iraqi forces, already battered by 5 weeks of airstrikes, collapsed in many sectors, surrendering en masse or simply abandoning their equipment and fleeing. Kuwait was liberated. The Iraqi army was effectively destroyed as an organized force. American and coalition casualties were remarkably light, 147 Americans killed in action, with additional losses from other coalition nations and from friendly fire incidents. On February 27, 1991, Bush addressed the nation. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. He announced a suspension of offensive combat operations effective midnight that night. The Gulf War was over. The jubilation was immediate and overwhelming. Bush's approval ratings soared to 91%, still the highest ever recorded for an American president, in the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm. The coalition had worked perfectly. The United Nations mandate had been executed with surgical precision. American military power had been demonstrated in a way that erased the lingering psychological shadow of Vietnam. It seemed, in those extraordinary days of late February 1991, that George Bush had achieved something genuinely historic, and yet there was a decision that was not made, a choice that was deliberately, consciously declined, and which would haunt both Bush personally and American foreign policy for years afterward. The coalition forces stopped at the Kuwait-Iraq border. They did not advance to Baghdad. They did not remove Saddam Hussein from power. The reasoning was strategically sound and Bush articulated it clearly. The coalition mandate was to liberate Kuwait, not to conquer Iraq. Advancing to Baghdad would have required fighting urban warfare in a city of 5 million people, would have caused enormous civilian casualties, would have destroyed the coalition by asking Arab members to participate in the occupation of an Arab capital, and would have left the United States holding Iraq like a broken vase, responsible for everything that followed, with no clear exit strategy and no prospect of a stable outcome. The mandate was clear. The job was done. Stop, he was right about all of this. History has validated his decision, or rather, history has validated it by demonstrating so dramatically what happens when the alternative approach is tried, as his son George W. Bush would discover beginning in 2003 when he did advance to Baghdad and did remove Saddam Hussein and found himself holding exactly the broken vase his father had predicted. But in the spring of 1991, with a Shia uprising in southern Iraq and a Kurdish uprising in the north both failing as Saddam brutally reasserted his authority, using the helicopter gunships that Bush had inexplicably allowed to fly in the ceasefire terms, there was a feeling of incomplete justice, of a job half done, that settled over the American public's initial euphoria like a slow fog. The images of Shia and Kurdish civilians being massacred while American forces stood at the border and watched were genuinely disturbing. Bush's decision not to intervene in those massacres, again, strategically defensible on the grounds that doing so would have meant adopting an open-ended commitment to regime change, nonetheless left a moral residue that couldn't be entirely explained away. These tensions aside, 1991 was the annus mirabilis of the Bush presidency. In addition to the Gulf War, that year saw the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. The failed coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, launched by communist hardliners who feared that a new Union treaty would strip Moscow of power, backfired catastrophically. The coup collapsed in 3 days. Gorbachev returned to power, but in a much weakened form. The Soviet republics began declaring independence, one after another. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. George Bush, who had managed this transformation with extraordinary care and skill over 3 years, who had maintained a relationship with Gorbachev that was both warm and strategically essential, who had resisted every temptation to gloat or lecture or claim credit in a way that could have damaged the process, George Bush was left holding the keys to a world that no longer worked the way it had for 45 years, and he had almost no idea what to do with it. This is not a criticism. Nobody did. The entire architecture of American foreign policy had been organized around the Soviet threat since 1947. The alliances, the military posture, the intelligence apparatus, the conceptual frameworks that guided decision-making, all of it had been built in relation to a specific adversary that had now vanished. Bush spoke about a new world order, a phrase that captured the aspiration without quite capturing the content. What, specifically, would replace the bipolar structure of the Cold War? How would America define its role in a world where it was the sole remaining superpower, without the constraining pressure of a rival superpower to define against? These were questions that Bush's administration had genuinely begun to grapple with, but had not fully resolved by the time his presidency ended. Meanwhile, something deeply unfair was happening in American domestic politics. The economy had entered a recession in 1990, one of those periodic economic downturns that are, in truth, largely immune to presidential policy but which the political system invariably attributes to whoever happens to be in office. The recession was relatively mild by historical standards. Unemployment peaked at 7.8% in June 1992, but it was real, and it was felt, and it was occurring at exactly the moment when American voters were tired of thinking about foreign policy and wanted to think about their own economic circumstances. The budget deal of 1990 became an albatross around Bush's neck of almost inexplicable severity. The federal deficit had been ballooning through the Reagan years, the result of the combination of tax cuts and defense spending increases that had been the signature of Reagan's domestic program. By 1990, it was clear that a major fiscal correction was needed, and Bush concluded, after months of negotiations with congressional leaders of both parties, that the only responsible course was a deficit reduction package that included both spending cuts and tax increases. He agreed to tax increases. He broke his read my lips pledge. This was, from a policy perspective, the responsible thing to do, and it contributed to the dramatic fiscal improvement that the United States experienced through the 1990s, laying the groundwork for the surpluses that materialized under Clinton. But politically, it was catastrophic. The conservative base of the Republican Party felt betrayed. Pat Buchanan, the acerbic conservative commentator, entered the Republican primary and ran an aggressively nationalist campaign against Bush, challenging him from the right and forcing him to defend himself against attacks from within his own party. Buchanan didn't win, but he inflicted real wounds, particularly in New Hampshire, where his strong showing in the February primary was interpreted as a signal that the conservative base was restive and potentially mutinous. And then there was Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire, idiosyncratic and mercurial, entered the presidential race as an independent in February 1992, dropped out in July, and re-entered in October, running a campaign built around his personal fortune, his folksy Texas manor, and his relentless focus on the federal deficit. Perot ultimately received 18.9% of the popular vote, the best performance by an independent candidate since Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. It is impossible to know with certainty how those votes would have been distributed in a two-person race, but the evidence suggests that Perot hurt Bush more than Clinton, draining exactly the kind of fiscally conservative independent voters who might otherwise have stayed in the Republican column. But the central truth of the 1992 election was simpler than any of these complicating factors. The central truth was Bill Clinton. Clinton was, by any measure, a political phenomenon of the first order, a man of extraordinary natural talent who combined intellectual brilliance, genuine empathy, tireless energy, and an almost supernatural ability to connect with people on an emotional level. He was the candidate of "I Feel Your Pain" in a campaign that was dominated by pain, the pain of a recession, the anxiety of a changing economic landscape, the sense that something essential about the American middle class was under threat. Against this opponent, at this moment, Bush was simply mismatched. It was not that he was wrong about the issues or incompetent in office. It was that he was constitutionally incapable of performing the kind of emotional connection that the moment demanded. When he checked his watch at a presidential debate, a gesture that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but was captured on camera and played in an endless loop, it became a symbol of detachment, of a man who wished he were somewhere else, of a president who had lost interest in the job of convincing people to give him another term. It was profoundly unfair as a summary of his character. It was also, politically, devastating. There was also the moment at the economic town hall debate in Richmond, Virginia, when a woman asked the candidates how the national debt had affected them personally, and Bush, perhaps confused by the phrasing, answered in terms of interest rates and macroeconomic effects rather than in terms of personal experience. Clinton glided forward, looked the woman directly in the eyes, and said he'd be glad to try to answer. He talked about people in his state who had lost their jobs, about going to plant closings, about the human reality of economic distress. The contrast was everything. Bush received 37.4% of the popular vote, the worst performance by an incumbent president since Herbert Hoover in 1932. Clinton won with 43%. Perot took the rest. On November 3, 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush became a one-term president. He was 68 years old. He had served in the Navy, in Congress, as ambassador to the UN, as CIA director, as vice president for 8 years, and as president for 4. He had managed the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, the liberation of Kuwait, and the American electorate had decided that this was not quite enough. The loss devastated him in ways that he rarely showed publicly. He had given everything to public service, had subordinated his own personality and preferences to the demands of institutional life for decades, had been loyal at enormous personal cost, had been prudent and careful and competent in ways that the history books would eventually recognize even if the electorate did not. And he had lost to someone he considered, in the particular way of patrician New England, not quite serious, too clever, too slick, too eager to please. The hurt was real and deep, and Barbara's hurt was perhaps even deeper. She had invested as much as he had traveled as many miles, had made as many phone calls, had been as fully present to the demands of public life, and the rejection was personal in a way that was hard to entirely separate from her sense of self. The transition to Clinton was gracious. Bush left a note in the Oval Office desk for his successor, a tradition that presidents have honored for decades, and what he wrote was characteristically generous. Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you. It was not performance. It was not irony. It was the genuine expression of a man who believed, deeply and constitutionally, that the institution was more important than the individual, that the good of the country superseded any personal grievance. He went back to Houston. He went back to Kennebunkport. He wrote his memoirs, a joint memoir with Brent Scowcroft, called A World Transformed, that is probably the best account of the geopolitical events of 1989 to 1991 written by any of the principals involved. He jumped out of airplanes. This is not a metaphor. Bush, who had been forced to parachute from his burning aircraft over the Pacific in 1944, became in his retirement an enthusiastic sport parachutist, jumping multiple times to celebrate birthdays, including his 75th, his 85th, and his 90th. There was something deeply characteristic about this. The man who had found himself falling toward the ocean in 1944 was now choosing to fall from planes he had boarded voluntarily, as an act of pure joy. He had made peace with the falling. He watched his son George W. Bush win the governorship of Texas in 1994, and his other son Jeb Bush narrowly lose the Florida governorship in the same year. He watched George W. run for president in 2000, and he was careful, very careful, about the public space he occupied in that campaign. He did not want to appear to be pulling strings. He did not want to overshadow his son or create the impression that the son's candidacy was simply an extension of the father's legacy. But privately, the pride was immense, complicated by the particular kind of parental anxiety that no amount of personal accomplishment ever quite eliminates. And then, when George W. became president, there came the most peculiar and painful dynamic of his post-presidential life, watching his son make decisions that he, the father, believed were wrong, and being largely unable to say so publicly without fracturing the family loyalty that was the bedrock of everything he believed. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, the decision to do precisely what he had declined to do in 1991, to march on Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein, was, by every account, deeply troubling to the elder Bush. He had lived through the reasoning, had made the decision himself, had understood exactly why stopping at the Kuwait border was correct. Now his son was choosing the other path, and the elder Bush was watching from a distance. He said nothing publicly that could be interpreted as a criticism of his son's decision. The relationship between the two men was deep and loving and also, in some ways, immensely complicated. George W. Bush had grown up in his father's shadow in more ways than the obvious one, had heard throughout his youth about the war hero, the congressman, the CIA director, the vice president, and had absorbed the pressure of that legacy in ways that shaped his character and his ambitions. There was, by multiple accounts, a desire on the son's part to go where the father had not gone, to complete what the father had left incomplete, to prove something that the father's caution had left unproven. It was a psychological dynamic as old as the Oedipus complex and as specific as the peculiar conditions of a powerful political family, Bush Sr. continued to age, continued to be active, continued to demonstrate the extraordinary resilience of his nature. He developed a form of Parkinson's disease that progressively limited his mobility, eventually confining him to a wheelchair and making it difficult for him to speak, but he remained mentally present and emotionally engaged far longer than the physical deterioration might have suggested. He was a familiar presence at public events, baseball games, golf tournaments, the funerals of heads of state and old friends, always with Barbara, always with the institutional dignity that had been the hallmark of his public life. Barbara Bush died on April 17, 2018, at the age of 92. They had been married for 73 years. When she died, something essential in George went with her. He had understood, throughout their long marriage, that she was the center of gravity around which his life orbited. Without her, the orbit was uncertain. He survived her by less than 8 months. Those months, by the accounts of those who saw him, were marked by a kind of patient waiting, not despair, not resignation, but the quietly determined endurance of a man who had survived many things and who would survive this, too. Until he didn't. George Herbert Walker Bush died on November 30, 2018, at 10:10 in the evening in Houston, Texas. He was 94 years old. His son George W. was with him on the phone in those final hours, and reports indicate that the elder Bush's last words, responding to his son's "I love you, Dad," were simple and characteristic. "I love you too." The tributes came in waves. They came from leaders he had known and worked with and sometimes opposed, from Gorbachev, from Kohl, from Tony Blair, from the Saudi royal family, from people all over the world who had dealt with him and found him to be, invariably, a man of his word and a man who understood that power, exercised correctly, is about restraint as much as it is about action. They came from Democrats who had opposed him and who now acknowledged, with the hindsight that political obituaries allow, that he had been genuinely good at the job. They came from military families, who remembered the Gulf War and its extraordinary success. They came from the people of Kuwait, who had a more vivid and less complicated relationship with George Bush's legacy than Americans did. His body was transported to Washington by train, a deliberate echo of the Lincoln funeral train, a choice that placed his passing in the continuum of American history. He lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Hundreds of thousands of people came to pay their respects. He was buried at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas, beside Barbara and beside Robin, the daughter he had lost in 1953, who had been waiting there for 65 years. So what do we make of him, finally? What is the measure of a man whose greatest achievements were defined by what he prevented, the crises that didn't happen, the wars that didn't start, the disasters that careful, patient, competent stewardship averted? How do you build a legacy out of counterfactuals? History has its own answer to this, and it is beginning to give it. The consensus among historians and foreign policy scholars has shifted remarkably since those difficult days of 1992. Survey after survey of presidential scholars now places Bush comfortably in the upper tier of American presidents, not in the first rank of Lincoln and FDR in Washington, but solidly in the second tier alongside men like Eisenhower and Truman, presidents whose genuine greatness was obscured in their own lifetimes by the political currents of the moment. What makes him great, in this revised assessment? Not the charisma he never had. Not the oratory, he was a genuinely poor public speaker, prone to syntactic tangles and what journalists unkindly called Bush speak, the verbal shorthand of a man whose mind moved faster than his tongue could follow. Not the vision, he was constitutionally suspicious of grand ideological visions, of the kind of sweeping historical narratives that politicians use to simplify complicated realities and sell them to mass audiences. What makes him great is the thing that is almost impossible to teach and almost impossible to perform: genuine competence in the exercise of power, combined with a genuine understanding of the limits of power. He knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know. He knew how to build teams and trust them. He knew that relationships, real relationships, built over years of consistent personal engagement, were the essential infrastructure of international diplomacy, more important than any single speech or summit meeting or formal treaty. He knew that the goal of foreign policy was not to win arguments but to shape events, and that shaping events often required giving adversaries and allies alike the space and credit they needed to move in the right direction. He also knew, or had learned, something that his years in the Pacific had taught him directly, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The flight to Chichi-Jima, completing the attack run with the plane on fire, that was not the act of a man who didn't feel fear. It was the act of a man who felt it completely and proceeded anyway, because the mission required it. That same quality informed his decision-making throughout his public life, even if the forms of courage required in the Oval Office were less physically immediate than those required in a burning Avenger over the Pacific. He was a man of his class and his time, which means he had the limitations of his class and his time. His patrician background made him genuinely uncomfortable with the democratic performance that modern politics requires, the retail politics of meeting strangers at diners and convincing them that you understand their lives, the emotional exhibitionism of sharing pain and hope in public settings. He was better at the private conversation, the phone call, the handwritten note, and he wrote tens of thousands of handwritten notes over the course of his life, to friends and strangers and people he had met once at a reception and never forgotten. His commitment to personal correspondence was extraordinary and genuine, a reflection of the conviction, instilled by Dorothy Walker Bush, that every person you encountered deserved to be treated with the attention and care they deserved as an individual. His racial politics were complicated. His record on civil rights was mixed, characterized by the genuine conviction that government should not discriminate, combined with a political opportunism, the Willie Horton ad, the nomination of Clarence Thomas to replace Thurgood Marshall, that was in tension with those convictions. He was a man of his generation in this respect, which is both an explanation and not quite an excuse. He was better, by most measures, than the median of his time and class. He was not as good as the best. His handling of the AIDS crisis was inadequate, particularly in his first years. The epidemic was devastating communities, particularly gay communities, and the federal government's response under Bush was slow and insufficient. He improved significantly toward the end of his term, appointing Magic Johnson to his AIDS Commission, meeting with activists, dramatically increasing federal research funding, but the early years were a genuine failure, shaped in part by the political constraints of serving a conservative base that was deeply hostile to the communities most affected by the disease. These things are part of the record. They belong in an honest account of who he was and what he did, and they do not, in the end, define him any more than the broken watch moment defines him, or the read my lips reversal defines him, or the single-term presidency defines him. They are chapters in a story whose arc runs longer than any of its individual episodes. The arc, finally, runs like this. A young man from a privileged family who could have coasted on that privilege chose instead to put himself in harm's way, in a Pacific war that was killing young men by the hundreds every day, because he believed that his country needed him. That same impulse, the sense of obligation, the belief that privilege creates responsibility rather than exempting you from it, drove every subsequent career decision, from the oil fields of Texas to the halls of Congress to the CIA to the vice presidential mansion to the Oval Office itself. He was not always right. He was not always eloquent. He was not always capable of making people feel what they needed to feel. But he was always trying, always working, always bringing the full weight of his considerable intelligence and experience to the problems in front of him, and doing so with a fundamental decency that his opponents found infuriating and his allies found sustaining. In the last years of his life, when he could no longer walk and his voice had largely left him, he still appeared at public events. He wore colorful socks and eccentricity that delighted everyone and that he embraced with the cheerful self-awareness of a man who had spent too many years in gray suits and didn't mind making up for it. He watched his grandchildren grow. He corresponded with his old friends. He jumped, one last time, out of an airplane on his 90th birthday. When he died, the world lost something that it doesn't quite have enough of, a man who was genuinely good at the hardest job in the world, who exercised that power with restraint and wisdom and a consistent concern for consequences beyond the immediate, and who did all of this without ever quite learning how to take credit for it. He wanted to be remembered as someone who had served, and who had served well. That, at minimum, is exactly what he was. And on the better days, in the long view of history, he was something considerably more, a statesman of genuine consequence, a president of real and enduring achievement, a man who, at the crucial juncture of the 20th century's final act, helped navigate the world from one era to another without catastrophe, without triumphalism, and without losing sight of the fundamental truth that power is most wisely used when it is used most carefully. He was the last of a certain kind of American leader formed by war, shaped by service, committed to institutions, skeptical of ideology, trusting of expertise, patient with complexity. Whether we will see his like again is one of the defining questions of our time, and the answer to that question will do much to determine the shape of the century ahead. George Herbert Walker Bush, born June 12, 1924, died November 30, 2018. The 41st President of the United States, the man who was there when the world changed, and who helped make sure that it changed for the better. There is a tendency, in the writing of political biography, to reach for easy conclusions, to wrap a life in a tidy moral, to point to the defining moment and say, this is what it all meant. But George H.W. Bush resists that kind of reduction. And perhaps that resistance is itself the most honest thing about him. Consider what it meant to live the life he lived, in the particular arc he lived it. He came of age in a world organized around certain fixed principles, that service was its own reward, that character was demonstrated through action rather than proclaimed through speech, that the institutions of democratic government were worthy of the deepest personal commitment precisely because they were fragile, because they depended on the willingness of individual citizens to subordinate private interest to public good. He internalized those principles so completely that he could not have separated them from himself without ceasing to be who he was. And then he watched those principles become, in the political culture of the late 20th century, almost incomprehensible. The America of the 1988 campaign, let alone the America of 1992, was a country that had learned to think about politics as entertainment, about politicians as performers, about authenticity as something manufactured and sold rather than lived and felt. Lee Atwater, who ran Bush's 1988 campaign and who later, dying of brain cancer, expressed genuine remorse for the methods he had used, understood this world instinctively. Bush did not understand it and, at some deep level, did not want to understand it. He thought it was a degradation of something important. And he was probably right, and being right about it didn't help him at all. The paradox of his political life is that the qualities which made him genuinely excellent at governing, the patience, the restraint, the willingness to listen, the capacity to act without needing to claim credit, the preference for the substantive over the theatrical, were exactly the qualities that made him poor at the modern business of winning and retaining democratic power. He was the right person for the Oval Office at the wrong moment in media history. This has happened before. It happens to the best ones, sometimes. The people who are most genuinely qualified for power are not always the ones who are best at acquiring and demonstrating it. George Washington was famously reluctant to seek power. Eisenhower had to be drafted into the presidential race. Churchill spent years in the political wilderness before his moment arrived. There is something about genuine competence and genuine humility that sits uneasily with the self-promotion that democratic politics demands, and the gap between the two is often where great leaders lose. But let's talk, for a moment, about what he got right, not just in the broad strokes of the Gulf War and German reunification and the managed end of the Cold War, but in the small things, the daily things, the texture of how he operated. He answered his own phone when possible. This was remarkable at his level of power. A man who could have insulated himself behind layers of staff and protocol chose instead to pick up the line and talk directly to whoever was calling. It was a choice that reflected something deeper than mere accessibility. It reflected a view of himself as genuinely accountable to the people he served, not as a distant figure to be approached through intermediaries. He wrote letters, thousands and thousands of letters, by hand, to constituents and colleagues and strangers and friends. When someone did him a favor, he wrote a note. When someone suffered a loss, he wrote a note. When he disagreed with something he had read, he sometimes wrote to the author. The letters are one of the great documentary resources for understanding who he was, because in them he was himself, direct, warm, occasionally sharp, often funny, always personal. A collection of his letters, published after his death, reveals a voice that is entirely absent from his public speeches, engaged, curious, genuinely interested in the people he was writing to, alive to the comic possibilities of almost every situation. He was funny. This is something that his public image almost entirely failed to capture, because the formality of his public persona and his discomfort with prepared speeches obscured a genuinely quick, dry wit that his intimates valued enormously. He could be devastating in private about people and situations that he was relentlessly diplomatic about in public. His letters are full of self-deprecating jokes, of wordplay, of the kind of humor that comes from someone who has seen enough of the world to find the absurdity in almost everything, including himself. He loved Barbara with a simplicity and a consistency that made everyone who witnessed their marriage feel, however briefly, that the world was basically in order. She was difficult in ways that made their partnership interesting. She pushed back, she disagreed. She said what she thought without extensive diplomatic preparation, and he loved all of this about her, found her directness clarifying in a life that was otherwise filled with people managing their communication with him. When she died, the element was gone from the compound, and the chemistry changed. He was a genuinely good father, in the ways that matter most, present when he could be present, interested in his children's lives, generous with praise without being empty about it, capable of the difficult conversations. He wrote to his sons when they were young, long letters that took the children's concerns seriously and tried to engage with their worlds on their own terms. The relationship with George W. was the most freighted and the most complex, but even there, at the core, was a love that was not conditional and not performed. He believed in the United States of America in the way that his generation believed in it, not with the angry nationalism of grievance, not with the uncritical triumphalism of the superpower that has never been tested, but with the specific, informed, earned faith of a man who had fought for the country and watched it work and watched it fail and kept working for it anyway. He believed it was worth the effort. He never stopped believing it was worth the effort. In the last years of his life, watching the political culture he had spent a lifetime serving become something he barely recognized, he kept that faith, kept working for it in whatever ways remained available to him, and kept his counsel about what he feared. The photograph taken on September 2, 1944, over the South Pacific, the young man in the parachute, falling through the open air toward the ocean below, captures something about George Bush that all the official portraits and the inauguration photographs and the state dinner images somehow miss. It captures him in the moment of pure consequence, the moment when everything he was and everything he believed was being tested by a set of circumstances he had not chosen and could not control. It captures him doing the right thing, completing the mission, then getting out, at genuine personal cost and with no guarantee of survival, let alone recognition. That is who he was. Not the awkward televised debater. Not the patrician who didn't know the price of milk. Not the man who lost to Bill Clinton. Not even the president who liberated Kuwait and presided over the end of the Cold War. He was, first and last, the young man who completed his mission while his plane was on fire, who did what duty required, who accepted the consequences, who held on and trusted that someone would come. Someone did come, that September afternoon in 1944. He was pulled from the Pacific by the crew of the USS Finback, and he was cold and injured in carrying a grief about his lost crewmates that would never entirely leave him. And he was alive, and there was more to do. There was always more to do. He did it. And when the doing was finally finished, and the sea finally came up to meet him again, he did not resist it. He held on for as long as holding on was possible, and then he let go, and he was at peace, and his son told him he was loved, and the long service was done. He earned his rest. He more than earned it. The measure of a life is not whether the recognition it receives in the moment matches the achievement it contains. Sometimes the moment misreads its greatest actors. Sometimes the full accounting takes decades, and comes only when the smoke has cleared and the passions have cooled and the actual shape of what was done becomes visible against the longer horizon of history. George Herbert Walker Bush lived that kind of life, a life whose true dimensions became clearer in his absence than they were in his presence. He was, for those who look carefully at the record, one of the finest public servants the United States has ever produced, a man of wide experience and deep integrity, of genuine strategic wisdom and personal decency, of courage in both the literal and the figurative sense. He was not perfect. No honest biography of him can claim that. He was a man of his time and his class, with all the limitations and all the gifts that those circumstances confer. He made mistakes, some of them serious. He left things undone that should have been done. He was sometimes too cautious, sometimes too loyal to people who did not deserve that loyalty, sometimes too willing to let the political pragmatists override his better instincts. But the sum of it, the full accounting, the weight of the life on the scales of history, comes out on the right side. It comes out on the right side by a substantial margin. He served at genuine personal cost and risk, across 5 decades of public life, in roles ranging from the cockpit of a torpedo bomber to the Oval Office of the most powerful nation on earth. He served with distinction, he served with honor, and he served with a selfless commitment to something larger than himself that the political culture of his final years made increasingly rare and increasingly difficult to sustain. For that, he deserved more than he received from his contemporaries. History, more patient and more clear-eyed, is beginning to give it to him now. To understand the full scope of George H.W. Bush's contribution to American history, you have to go back before the headline moments, before Kuwait and Berlin and Gorbachev, and look at the years in between the famous chapters, at the work that was done in the quiet stretches when nobody was paying particular attention. Because the visible achievements of any life are invariably the product of invisible preparation, and the preparation in Bush's case was long, varied, and in many respects extraordinary. Consider his years in Congress. From 1967 to 1971, he was one of 435 members of the House of Representatives, which is a number that nearly guarantees obscurity for all but the most ambitious or the most provocative. Bush was neither particularly ambitious for personal recognition, the family code was against it, nor particularly provocative. He was, instead, industrious and collegial, which in the culture of the House of Representatives in the late 1960s was both less glamorous and ultimately more effective than the showman's approach. The vote he cast for the Fair Housing Act of 1968 deserves particular emphasis. The act, which prohibited discrimination in the sale and rental of housing on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, was vigorously opposed by a significant portion of the conservative Texas constituency Bush represented. He knew, when he voted for it, that he was taking a genuine political risk. His constituents were not monolithically hostile to civil rights legislation, but there was a substantial portion of his district that felt deeply opposed to federal intervention in what they considered private economic transactions. Bush received a flood of angry correspondence after the vote. He responded to constituents personally, explaining his reasoning, acknowledging their disagreement, defending his position. He went to his district and held town meetings where people who were furious with him were given the chance to say so to his face. He believed the legislation was right. He said so. He took the heat. This is not a particularly dramatic story as political stories go. It doesn't involve crossed Rubicons or burning planes, but it reveals something essential about his character that the dramatic stories sometimes obscure. He could be courageous on the unglamorous, difficult, domestic questions, not just the grand international ones. The 2 years he spent at the United Nations, from 1971 to 1973, gave him something that almost no subsequent American president had: incomparable depth, direct, sustained personal experience with the texture of international multilateral diplomacy. The UN is often dismissed, by both its critics on the right and its frustrated supporters on the left, as a talking shop, a place where nations send their frustrations to be formally registered and then ignored. There is some truth in this, as Bush understood perfectly well. But the UN also serves functions that are less visible and less dramatic than the Security Council debates that get televised. It is a place where relationships are built, where information is exchanged, where the enormous informal network of international diplomacy is maintained through the daily accumulation of conversations in corridors and cafeterias and private offices. Bush was exceptionally good at this. His natural gift for personal relationship building, for remembering names and details, for following up on previous conversations, for making people feel that they had his genuine attention, these qualities, which could seem almost frivolous in the domestic political context where they sometimes read as glad-handing, were exactly the qualities most valued in the international diplomatic world. An ambassador who makes his counterparts feel genuinely respected and heard gains access and trust that no amount of formal power can purchase. Bush understood this instinctively, and he cultivated it systematically. He met, during his time at the UN, with the representatives of nations that most American officials barely acknowledged. He took seriously the concerns of small countries that had no particular strategic value to the United States. He was, as a result, extraordinarily well networked in the international community by the time he left the UN, and many of the relationships he built there proved to be directly valuable a decade later when he was assembling the Gulf War Coalition. The year at the CIA, 1976 to 1977, was in some ways the most clarifying year of his career. The intelligence world operates on principles that are in many respects the inverse of the political world. In politics, everything is public, every decision, every position, every calculation is eventually exposed to scrutiny and judgment. In intelligence, the most important things are by definition invisible. The operations that succeed are the ones nobody ever hears about. The analysis that shapes the most consequential decisions is delivered in classified briefings that the public will never read. Success, in the intelligence world, is measured by what doesn't happen, by the attacks that were prevented, the crises that were averted, the secrets that were kept. Bush found this inverted logic congenial. He was, in some respects, a man who operated on intelligence principles even when he was in the political world. He valued information over rhetoric, process over theater, substance over performance. His year at the CIA reinforced these inclinations and gave him a depth of understanding about the role of intelligence in national security decision-making that proved invaluable when he was president. He knew how to read an intelligence estimate. He knew what the confidence levels meant. He knew the difference between solid intelligence and speculation. He knew, crucially, the limits of intelligence, what it could and could not tell you, and why even the best intelligence services in the world are sometimes fundamentally wrong. This knowledge made him a better consumer of intelligence as president than most of his predecessors or successors. He asked the right questions. He pushed back on confident assessments when he thought they warranted pushback. He understood that the people in the intelligence community, like all human beings, were subject to the biases and blind spots that affect everyone who looks at a complicated world and tries to make sense of it, and he factored that understanding into how he used what they told him. The 8 years of the vice presidency, from 1981 to 1989, are the most difficult to evaluate from the outside, because the vice president, by design and by necessity, is invisible in proportion to his effectiveness. A vice president who is publicly asserting his own views and creating the impression of division within the administration is a liability. A vice president who disappears entirely into ceremonial irrelevance is a wasted asset. The ideal vice president, and this is what Bush was, by virtually all accounts occupies the middle ground, fully engaged, fully informed, present at every significant meeting, but publicly subordinate, publicly loyal, publicly supportive of the president's positions even when those positions differ from his own. The specific ways in which Bush's views differed from Reagan's, and the specific ways in which he managed those differences internally, are not entirely knowable, because the institutional code of vice presidential discretion is robust and because Bush himself was not a man who sought to relitigate those years in his memoirs or in interviews. What is knowable is that the two men had genuinely different temperaments and, on some issues, genuinely different instincts. Reagan was the grand strategist, the visionary, the man who believed that the sheer force of American clarity and American confidence could change the world. Bush was the pragmatist, the relationship builder, the man who believed that changing the world required understanding it first, which required talking to more people and making fewer categorical statements. These differences were managed, for 8 years, with considerable skill and discretion. There is one area where the management was less successful, and where the consequences were significant: the Iran-Contra affair. The precise contours of Bush's involvement and knowledge remain disputed, and the full documentary record has never been entirely released. What is clear is that Bush was aware of the general contours of the Iran arms sales. He attended meetings at which they were discussed. He read reports that described them. He was, in the precise sense of the term, in the loop on that much. His claim to have been unaware of the diversion of funds to the Contras, the specific element that made the affair a potential criminal conspiracy, was always contested by his critics and was, at minimum, convenient. This is the area of his record where honest assessment requires acknowledging genuine ambiguity. He may have been exactly as ignorant of the diversion as he claimed. He may have known more than he admitted. The documentary evidence is incomplete, and the full truth may never be known. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Bush's handling of Iran-Contra, both his public statements about his role and his decision, as president, to pardon several of the figures involved, was the least transparent episode of an otherwise notably transparent career, and that the pardon in particular, issued on Christmas Eve 1992, just weeks before he left office, struck many observers as self-serving in a way that conflicted with the public service ethic he embodied in virtually every other aspect of his career. He paid a price for it. The pardon of Caspar Weinberger, the former Secretary of Defense, came just days before Weinberger was scheduled to go to trial, and independent counsel Lawrence Walsh publicly accused Bush of participating in a cover-up. It was the worst accusation of his career, and while the political moment had already passed, he had already lost the election. The reputational damage was real, but there is the rest of the record, too. There is the decision, as president, to sign the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation in American history, which prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, public accommodations, transportation, and telecommunications. Bush championed the ADA over the objections of business groups who argued the compliance costs would be prohibitive, and the legislation has since transformed the physical and economic landscape of the United States in ways that are enormous and almost entirely taken for granted by the people who benefit from it. There is the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, the most significant environmental legislation since the original Clean Air Act of 1970, which established the cap-and-trade system for sulfur dioxide emissions that dramatically reduced acid rain, and which created the framework for addressing other air pollutants that had been political stalemates for years. Bush was a genuine environmentalist, not in the performative, ideological sense that the term sometimes implies, but in the practical sense of a man who had grown up sailing and fishing and hunting and who understood intuitively that the natural world was both intrinsically valuable and intimately connected to human well-being. His environmental record is considerably better than his contemporaries in either party typically acknowledged. There is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Bush negotiated and signed into law before leaving office. Clinton got credit for ratifying it, but the negotiating architecture was Bush's work. The creation of NAFTA reflected Bush's deep belief in the expansion of international trade as both an economic and a foreign policy tool, a belief grounded in his direct experience of the ways in which economic interdependence creates the conditions for political stability. And there is, woven through all of this, the extraordinary personal story of a man who was simultaneously managing the largest historical events of the late 20th century and maintaining a personal life of remarkable warmth and consistency. The Bush family holidays at Kennebunkport, the annual gatherings that brought together his 5 children and their families, the old friends from every chapter of his life who remained friends, these were not performances. They were the real thing, the actual fabric of a life lived in relationship with other people. He wrote notes to his grandchildren. He kept up with the children of old friends. He called people on their birthdays, or had his staff remind him to call them, which amounts to the same thing. He was, in private, the person he appeared to be in public: decent, interested, warm, and genuinely delighted by the company of people he liked. One story, small but revealing: in the early years of his post-presidency, he received a letter from a young man who had written to thank him for a personal note Bush had sent after the young man's father, a man Bush had known in some context he could not immediately place, had died. The young man said the note had meant more than anything else in those difficult weeks, because it came from someone who had genuinely known his father and who took the time to say so in writing. Bush, who received thousands of letters, wrote back, He wrote back personally, not through a staff member, and he asked the young man questions about his father and about how the family was doing. The exchange continued for several letters, and years later the young man said that it had given him something he still couldn't quite describe, the sense that someone of genuine historical consequence had seen his family in its particular grief and cared enough to reach out and keep reaching out. This was who he was. Not in spite of the history he had made but alongside it, inseparably entangled with it. The foreign policy legacy deserves one final look, because it is the part of his record that has most clearly aged in his favor, and because understanding why it aged that way tells you something important about the relationship between statecraft and time. When Bush left office in January 1993, the foreign policy consensus in Washington, across parties and across ideological lines, was moving in a direction that he had gently but consistently resisted. The direction was optimism, specifically the optimism of the unipolar moment. With the Soviet Union gone and the United States standing alone as the world's dominant military, economic, and cultural power, there was a temptation, a powerful, genuinely seductive temptation, to believe that America could now reshape the world in its own image, that the constraints of the Cold War having been removed, American power could be deployed more actively and more ambitiously than had been possible when the risk of Soviet counter-escalation had to be factored into every calculation. Bush had never shared this optimism, or at least had never shared it in its more expansive versions. He believed in American power, deeply and genuinely. He had used it, effectively and decisively, in the Gulf War. But he also believed in the limits of American power, in the fact that power deployed without adequate attention to consequences, without sufficient understanding of the specific context, without the patient diplomatic preparation that brings others along rather than dragging them behind, was power poorly used. The Gulf War itself was structured entirely around this principle: overwhelming military force, deployed in the shortest possible time, within a mandate that was specific and limited. With a coalition that gave the effort international legitimacy and practical depth, the years that followed his presidency illustrated, repeatedly and sometimes catastrophically, what happens when the lessons embedded in that approach are forgotten. The interventions of the Clinton years, in Somalia, in Haiti, in Bosnia, eventually in Kosovo, varied enormously in their conduct and their outcomes, but the recurring tension in all of them was between the aspiration to do good and the difficulty of translating that aspiration into sustainable, durable change. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the culminating example, an intervention conducted with extraordinary military efficiency that created political consequences of staggering complexity and cost. Bush had been exactly right in 1991 about why stopping at the Kuwait border was the right decision. He was still exactly right in 2003, watching from Houston as his son made the other choice. History vindicates the careful ones slowly and incompletely. It vindicates the dramatic ones immediately and loudly, and then sometimes revises its judgment later, more quietly. George Bush's contribution to the history of the late 20th century is becoming clearer as the distance increases, and what is becoming clearest is the sheer scale of what was accomplished, not through rhetoric, not through dramatic gestures, not through the performance of leadership, but through the patient, competent, deeply experienced exercise of executive power at a moment when the world genuinely needed it. The Cold War ended peacefully. This is a fact so remarkable, so divergent from the scenarios that had been rehearsed in academic journals and war games for 4 decades, that it is easy to take for granted. But think about the alternative scenarios, about what the end of the Soviet Empire could have looked like if different people had been making different decisions at different moments. Think about the Soviet nuclear arsenal, which remained enormous even as the political structure collapsed around it. Think about the Soviet satellite states, released from decades of enforced loyalty, potentially descending into the ethnic and territorial conflicts that, in Yugoslavia, consumed tens of thousands of lives. Think about the scenario in which German reunification becomes a crisis rather than a liberation, in which the Soviet hardliners find the pretext they need to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, in which the Berlin Wall falls but is then rebuilt in some form, in which the transition from one world order to another becomes violent rather than peaceful. None of that happened. The Cold War ended, and the Soviet Empire dissolved, and Germany reunited, and the Warsaw Pact nations found their way to democratic governance over the course of the 1990s, and the nuclear weapons were secured. And a new era began imperfectly, with new challenges and new failures, but without the catastrophe that was always the worst-case possibility. George Bush was not the only person responsible for this outcome. Gorbachev deserves enormous credit. Helmut Kohl, Lech Walesa, the leaders of the satellite states who managed the transition, the ordinary citizens of Eastern Europe who pushed for change, all of them were essential. But Bush was the American president during the critical years, and his decisions shaped the context in which everyone else was operating, and his decisions were, on the evidence, remarkably well judged. For all this, he received a watch-check moment at a town hall debate. A loss to the candidate who could feel people's pain, and 47.1% of the vote in a three-way race. He went home to Kennebunkport and jumped out of airplanes and wrote letters and watched the world go on. He watched a lot, at the end. He had time to watch, and he had the particular kind of perspective that comes from having been at the center of events and then moved to the periphery, not the bitter perspective of the humiliated, not the nostalgic perspective of the sentimentalist, but the clear-eyed, sometimes amused, sometimes deeply worried perspective of someone who had seen how the machine works and who understood what was required to make it work well. He did not lose faith. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, in the end. After everything, the Pacific, the oil fields, the campaigns he lost, the son he buried, the daughter who died, the partner who left before him, the loss that ended his political career, he did not lose faith. Not in America, not in the capacity of individuals to make choices that matter, not in the basic proposition that a life spent in service is a life well spent, even when the service is not recognized and the rewards are not commensurate with the sacrifice. There is a reason why the posthumous tributes to George H.W. Bush were so genuine, so widespread, and so emotionally charged. People who had spent years dismissing him as a one-term president, a transitional figure, a bland establishment placeholder, those people found themselves, in the days after his death, reconsidering. Found themselves reading his letters and discovering a person who was funnier and warmer and more three-dimensional than the public figure had suggested. Found themselves looking at the historical record of 1989 to 1993 and realizing what had been accomplished. Found themselves, perhaps, recognizing something they had missed or chosen not to see when he was alive and when the missing of it was convenient. He didn't need the recognition. That is what the family code had taught him, what Dorothy Walker Bush had insisted on, what the experience of the Pacific had confirmed. You do the work, you do it right, and you let the work speak for itself. The question of whether others applaud is theirs to answer. The question of whether the work was worth doing is yours. He answered that question every day of his adult life, in the same way, with the same answer. It was worth doing. It was worth doing right. It was worth doing even when the cost was high and the recognition was absent and the outcome was uncertain. Service was its own justification, and the Republic was the vessel that made the service meaningful. And the vessel was worth preserving. He preserved it. On his watch, at the most dangerous and most consequential moment of the late 20th century, when everything might have gone terribly wrong and instead went right, or at least right enough, he preserved it. The Republic survived. The world survived. The Cold War ended without a shot fired in anger between the superpowers that had aimed their weapons at each other for 45 years. Germany reunified. Kuwait was liberated. And George Herbert Walker Bush went home and jumped out of airplanes. He had earned it. Every last second of the long blue freefall. He had earned it 50 years before, on a September afternoon over the Pacific. When he held his course and completed his mission and trusted that someone would come, someone did. Someone always did. That was the faith at the center of everything, not naive faith, not faith that ignored the evidence of how often people fail and institutions crumble and good work goes unrecognized, but faith nonetheless, informed and tested and ultimately unbroken. Faith that the effort matters. Faith that the doing is the point. George Herbert Walker Bush, 1924 to 2018. He jumped from planes. He wrote letters. He served. He endured. He loved. And in the end, he let go with the quiet grace of a man who had done everything that could reasonably be asked of him, and a few things that couldn't. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in ways that will continue to become clearer as the years pass and the history settles into its final shape, quite extraordinary. There are dimensions of George H.W. Bush's presidency that get lost in the sweeping narrative of Cold War endings and Gulf War victories, quieter moments that reveal the texture of the man more completely than the headline events. Take, for example, the way he ran the White House itself, the daily operational culture of his administration. Bush was an early riser, typically at his desk by 7 in the morning, having already read the newspapers and reviewed the overnight intelligence. He was not a man who needed a team of staff to tell him what he thought. He came to meetings with his own analysis, his own questions, his own instincts about what the right course of action was, and he was willing to change those instincts in the face of compelling evidence, but the evidence had to be genuinely compelling, not merely insistent. He ran a remarkably tight ship for a White House, which is to say a remarkably low-drama ship. The Reagan years had been marked by a level of internal conflict, the constant tensions between the pragmatists and the ideologues, the rivalries between cabinet departments, the spectacular failures of coordination that produced things like Iran-Contra that Bush found both exhausting and unnecessary. He believed that internal conflicts should be resolved internally, that the spectacle of administration officials feuding through leaks and backgrounders was both undignified and counterproductive, and he set about creating a culture that reflected those values, Brent Scowcroft was central to this effort. As National Security Advisor, Scowcroft managed the interagency process with a quiet authority that kept the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA in reasonable alignment on most major questions. This was not a trivial achievement. The turf wars between national security agencies are ancient and deep-rooted, and the pressure to leak unflattering information about rival agencies to sympathetic journalists is nearly irresistible to officials who believe their agency's perspective is being systematically undervalued. Under Scowcroft, who had a well-earned reputation for both intellectual rigor and personal integrity, these pressures were largely contained. The system worked. The decision-making culture Bush created was consultative without being indecisive. He solicited the views of his principal advisors with genuine interest, pushed them to defend their positions, played devil's advocate when he thought a consensus was forming too easily, and then made his own judgment and stood by it. He was not a man who agonized publicly or second-guessed himself for the benefit of his staff. The decision, once made, was made. The implementation could begin. This was nowhere more visible than in the Gulf War deliberations. The period from August 1990 to January 1991, from the Iraqi invasion to the beginning of Desert Storm, was the longest and most sustained test of his decision-making process, and it is worth understanding in some detail, because the deliberateness of the process is precisely what made the outcome possible. From the first hours after the Iraqi invasion, Bush's posture was that Kuwait would be restored to its sovereignty. This was not, at the time, the universal view. There were voices within the administration, and many more outside it, who argued that Kuwait was not a vital enough interest to justify a major military response, that the United States had larger strategic priorities in the region and around the world, that a diplomatic solution, however humiliating, was preferable to a war with unpredictable consequences. Baker, who was abroad when the invasion happened, was initially somewhat cautious. Powell, who had seen Vietnam from the inside and who carried the lessons of that failure deep in his institutional memory, was deeply reluctant to recommend military action without a clear and achievable objective and a viable exit strategy. Bush listened to all of this. He registered the caution, the skepticism, the legitimate concerns about escalation and unintended consequences. And then he returned, again and again, to the basic proposition: an act of aggression that rewarded the aggressor could not be allowed to stand, because allowing it to stand would send a signal that would reverberate throughout the region and throughout the world, that borders could be crossed by force, that powerful neighbors could simply absorb weaker ones, that the post-Cold War international order had no teeth. He was thinking about precedent. He was thinking about the long game. He was thinking about what kind of world his grandchildren would inherit if the principle of territorial integrity was simply abandoned at the first serious test of the post-Cold War era. This was not rhetoric. It was genuine strategic thinking, and it was exactly the kind of thinking that his decades of experience in foreign policy had made him capable of. The diplomatic effort that ran parallel to the military buildup deserves particular attention. Bush worked the phone with a tirelessness that was remarkable even for a man known for his commitment to personal communication. He called King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who had to be persuaded to allow the stationing of American troops on Saudi soil, not a trivial ask, given the political and religious sensitivities involved. He called President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, who was crucial both for Egypt's own military contribution and for his influence with other Arab states. He called King Hussein of Jordan, who was in an agonizing position between his long friendship with the United States and his economic dependence on Iraq. He called the leaders of Syria, of Turkey, of every Gulf state. He called Gorbachev, repeatedly, to ensure that the Soviets would not exercise their veto in the Security Council or provide any material support to Baghdad. The result was a coalition of 35 nations, including 8 Arab states, a fact of extraordinary symbolic and practical significance. Arab soldiers fighting alongside American soldiers against an Arab aggressor was not something that would have been possible without the relationships that Bush had built over decades of personal diplomacy, and it was not something that would happen again in any subsequent American military adventure in the region. There was also the question of Israel. Israel was not part of the coalition. Its inclusion would have been catastrophically destabilizing for the Arab members, but Israel's cooperation and restraint were essential to the coalition's survival. When Saddam began firing Scud missiles at Israeli cities, the pressure on the Israeli government to respond militarily was enormous. The Israeli public demanded action. The Israeli military had plans ready. Bush was asking them, in effect, to accept attacks on their civilians without responding, and to trust the coalition to handle the problem. It was an extraordinary request, and the fact that Israel complied was a measure of something, of the trust in the American commitment, yes, but also of something more specific, of the trust in the judgment and the good faith of this particular American president. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir made the decision not to retaliate, and it was one of the most difficult decisions of his political career. He later said that the pressure from his military and his cabinet was enormous, and that he would not have been able to hold that position without absolute confidence that the coalition forces were genuinely committed to eliminating the Scud threat and that the United States would have his country's back in the aftermath. Bush provided that confidence, personally, through direct and frequent communication with Shamir. He made commitments. He kept them. The post-war period, the weeks and months after Desert Storm, when the coalition had stopped at the Kuwait border and Saddam was still in power and the Shia and Kurdish uprisings were being crushed, was the most morally difficult period of his presidency. The images that came out of southern Iraq in March 1991, of Shia civilians being slaughtered by Iraqi helicopter gunships, of mass graves being filled with people who had risen up in the belief that American encouragement would become American protection, these images were genuinely horrifying. And they generated a moral pressure on the administration that was intense. Bush maintained the decision not to intervene. He and Scowcroft, in their joint memoir, were candid about the reasoning. The coalition mandate did not extend to protecting civilians from their own government, and extending it unilaterally would have fractured the coalition, exceeded the Security Council mandate, and committed the United States to an open-ended involvement in Iraqi internal affairs for which there was neither a clear objective nor a clear exit. The argument is strategically coherent. It is also, as Bush himself acknowledged, genuinely painful. He was not indifferent to the suffering. He was choosing between competing goods, or rather, between a lesser evil and a greater one, and he made his choice and lived with it. There is a letter in the archival record, not widely circulated, in which Bush writes to a friend about those weeks in March 1991, about watching the television footage of the Shia uprising and its suppression, about the weight of knowing that American encouragement had contributed to the uprising and American restraint was contributing to its failure. The letter is notable not for any policy revelation but for its emotional honesty, for the admission that the right decision can still be a devastating one, that strategic correctness does not insulate a human being from the moral weight of what follows. This quality, the willingness to feel the weight of his decisions, to carry it rather than deflect it, to acknowledge the cost of even the right choices, was one of the things that made him, at his best, an unusually decent figure in the history of American power. Power tends to insulate those who wield it from the consequences of their choices. Bush, by temperament and by the training of a lifetime, refused that insulation. He kept accounts with himself, privately, in letters and in diaries, with an honesty that his public persona never quite conveyed. The diary he kept during the Gulf War period, portions of which were published, is a remarkable document. It captures a man who was simultaneously managing one of the most complex military and diplomatic operations in American history and experiencing it as a deeply personal moral test, who was worried about individual soldiers, who was thinking about the families of the people who would be killed, who was asking himself, again and again, whether he had done everything possible to ensure that the war would be short and the victory decisive and the cost in human life as low as it could be made. He was not a pacifist. He was not a man who believed that force should never be used, or that the use of force was always a failure of diplomacy. His war record alone made those positions implausible. But he was a man who took the use of force enormously seriously, who brought to the question of when and how to use it the same deliberate, consultative, consequence-focused approach he brought to every major decision, and who never confused the excitement of military success with the broader purpose that military force is supposed to serve. The friendship he formed with Mikhail Gorbachev during those years is another dimension of his presidency that deserves attention. In the abstract, the relationship between an American president and the leader of the Soviet Union is a relationship between adversaries institutionally. Ideologically, strategically, they represented opposing systems and opposing interests. In the specific case of Bush and Gorbachev, however, something more complicated and more human developed, a genuine personal respect and, over time, a genuine personal affection that